An excerpt from A Flight to Nowhere, a novel by Blas Padrino. Prologue. Camagüey, Cuba, October 28, 1959. The rain poured in rivers all afternoon, but stopped shortly before the twin-engine Cessna lifted off the slick grass runway. The plane made 2 circles above endless sugarcane fields that glistened fresh, wet, green against the setting sun, then pointed its nose toward the vanishing daylight and climbed into darkening skies. The passenger took one deep breath and shuffled the sheaf of papers in his hands. His report did not contain what he'd been ordered to write, but he couldn't bring himself to smear an innocent man. He'd told them as much over the phone already, and felt no apprehension about telling them again to their faces when he arrived. If it meant a revolution inside the revolution, so be it. The ball was in Fidel's court. He stretched his legs and lit up a cigar, leaned back and let his hat dip over his forehead, its wide brim just above the eyebrows. He took a puff and watched the reflection of the burning tip flicker on the plane's window. Fidel will curse and rail for who knows how long. Who cares? His tirades are starting to wear on everyone already. He knows he can't touch me. The people adore me just as much as they fear him. Just the other day he said, if something happens to me, there's Raul. He's so full of shit. Nobody can stand his brother. Fidel thinks I'm going to do whatever Raul wants just because he made him my boss. He's got another thing coming. He can rant all he wants. I'm not going to stop Uber in the back. Either Fidel gets rid of the communists or there's going to be another civil war. He took another puff of the cigar and watched the ring of ash around the tip glow red. He'd never been afraid of confrontations. Not in the least. Wasn't he the one who led the attack on Santa Clara that broke the back of Batista's army? The one who marched first, triumphant, into Havana. Where were Fidel and Raul on January 1st? It was he and Che and Uber who took the fight to the enemy, while Fidel and Raul hid in the mountains. No, he wasn't afraid of confrontations, especially those he knew he couldn't lose. Actually, he was looking forward to it. Half the cabinet was ready to abandon Fidel over the communists. Even Urrutia, the president, had told him he'd had enough. The plane reached cruising altitude and streaked through an indigo blanket of sky. The evening floated beneath him in dark patches, broken by occasional points of light below, huddled like candles on a birthday cake, each cluster marking a small town nestled on the water's edge. All of a sudden he heard a high-pitched whistle coming from above. 3 bursts of light flashed against the night. The plane shook and banked right, hard. It no longer flew in a straight line, but swerved and shuddered in haphazard fashion, like a kite snapped off from its string. One moment he was glued to the seat by the G-forces. The next he was being jostled like a pip inside a maraca. "Que pasa, coño?" he shouted. He got no answers from the pilot, whose body lay crumpled against the controls. The engine gasped, like a dying man fighting for one last breath. The plane shook again. His head hit something. The hat went flying. The cigar slipped from its grasp. The plane went into a spinning dive. Darkness, noise, silence. Black sky became unfathomed water. Chapter 1. Miami, Florida, summer of 2009. The gray cloud on the laptop screen gasped and sucked wind with each successive frame. It staggered across the ocean with the broken steps of a Frankenstein monster, or so it seemed when tracked through time-lapse photography. Felix Robles pointed to the black heart at its center. "This is no chicken shit hurricane. Could be another Andrew." "You sure?" Mario Fernandez looked up from his espresso and slid his chair closer. He craned his neck and squinted at the slideshow of satellite photos. Felix pushed his coffee cup across the restaurant table to make room. "You can lay off your Castro's dying news stories and take the thermometer out of his ass for a week or so. When this storm hits, you'll be busy covering it." Mario looked through the window at the little Havana traffic, stroked his mustache, and cleared his throat. "So who's going to get it?" Felix laughed and poked his friend's arm. "I'm a weatherman, not a babalao." He reached for his café con leche and dipped a slice of Cuban bread in it. "Wherever it ends up, it won't be pretty. Has the potential to become a Cat 5. He slurped down the bread. Mario's eyebrows bunched up at the bridge of his nose, his signature end of newscast look. At least give me probabilities, a leg up. You must have some idea. Felix shook his head and raised his eyes to the ceiling. You haven't changed since our days at Miami High, always looking for a gap to shoot through. He looked around the room, made sure no one else could hear, leaned closer to Mario and spoke in a whisper. We haven't put out a probability cone yet, so if you quote me on this, I'll yank your hair plugs. What hair plugs? Mario's mustache drooped around his lips. He ran his fingers through his pompadour. This is all natural. Felix chuckled. Yeah, right. From your own armpits. Mario scowled. You're making fun of my livelihood, man. That's cruel. He gave Felix a little shove. Just for that, you can get the check. Both men laughed. Felix slid his finger over the mouse pad and double-clicked. A map of the Caribbean popped up on the screen. It's barreling out of the Atlantic. He moved the cursor as he spoke. There's a high-pressure system to the north. Stationary. We'll keep the storm heading west, at least until it hits the Florida Straits. I'm guessing a path north of Puerto Rico. Maybe slam the Dominican, maybe Grand Turk and the north coast of Cuba. The high's been wiggling at the edges. My gut says it'll slide north eventually. What's that supposed to mean? This storm has Key West written all over it. Maybe a direct hit, maybe just a swipe, but it'll make its presence known. Key West, huh? So much for my fishing plans. What then? That's as far as I'll stick my neck out. Once it reaches the Gulf, all bets are off. If I were you, I'd sell that pretty boat of yours the hell out of Alamorada and haul out for Boca Raton. How soon's it hitting the fan? Another 5 days before it rears its ugly head. You can start preaching preparedness in your newscast. Felix shut down the computer and put it in his briefcase. I gotta get to the office in a few days. We'll be flying over the storm. And there's a ton of things to do. He gave Mario a sidelong glance. You want to come along? Do a report from the Eye of the Beast? Thanks, but no thanks, buddy. That stuff's not for me. But I can ask Terry. She lives for that kind of drama. Your co-anchor? Felix's pitch rose to a mocking falsetto. Terry Toledo, the news tornado? That's the one. She's smoking hot. I'll take her any day. Don't get your hopes up. She only swoons for millionaire athletes, and you're no Alex Rodriguez. Hey, I may not have a running back's built like you used to have, but I still got my Latin charm. What do you mean you used to have? I'll have you know I can still bench press 250 pounds. Yeah, right, and I'm going to have lunch with the Pope this afternoon. Mario shook his head and gave Felix a pat in the back. You always were the class clown. He got up, wiped his mouth with a napkin and dropped it on the table. I'll give Terry your cell. Got to go huddle with the writers. Thanks for the heads up. He touched 2 fingers to his forehead in a semi-military salute and hurried off. Felix gulped the rest of his coffee and whistled to the waitress. Put it in my tab, Christina, he shouted, tossed a few singles on the table and walked out. It was still early, but the Miami August sun was already roasting the pavement as Felix walked to his Ford Escape. He got in, started the engine, and hit the button that opened the sunroof, just as the air conditioner fan blasted its initial shot of hot air at his face. He turned the AC control knob down to frozen tundra and turned west onto the Tamiami Trail. When the traffic light on Douglas Road turned red, a street vendor ran between the cars, holding plastic bags full of mamoncillos for $1 a sack. Felix had a weakness for the little green fruits with a brittle rind that split in half when he bit into them. Licking at the silky layer of meat around the seed was as satisfying as the tart taste of the juice. He waved the bill through the open sunroof. The man raced over, tossed him a bag, took the money, and weaved his way back to the sidewalk as the traffic light turned green. Felix closed the sunroof and sucked on mamoncillos while he drove to the campus of Florida International University. By the time he arrived, he'd gone through half the bag. He parked on the lot across from the National Hurricane Center building and stood outside for a moment. He studied the bunker-like structure, windowless and austere, a concrete box topped by satellite dishes, radio antennas, and wind gauges. a storm chaser's bat cave. As he walked through the front door, his cell phone began playing Stormy Weather. He flipped the cover open. Felix here. Mr. Robles, this is Terry Toledo from WHOT News. Mario gave me your number. His eyes lit up. He cleared his throat. Yes, he said you might call about doing a report on Frodo. Can you get me a seat on the Hurricane Hunter? There's an open seat on the next flight. I'll talk to the mission coordinator. He paused. I've got to warn you, it's a bumpy ride. I can handle it. Get me on the plane, and I'll give you your 15 minutes of fame. Terry hesitated. Well, not 15 minutes, but you'll get 30 seconds in prime time, leading off the 6 o'clock news. What do you say? I'll speak with the PR people this afternoon. They don't mind the press coverage. The P-3 Orion is scheduled to fly out of MacDill Air Force Base in a couple of days. You'll have to come for a pre-flight briefing day after tomorrow at 1 p.m. Can I bring a cameraman on the flight? There's no room on the plane. You'll have to shoot your own video. I can live with that. Get here by noon and I'll give you a quick tour of the center. I'll be there and bring lunch. How's that? Perfect. See you then. Felix flipped the cell phone cover shut. Yes, he pumped his fist, and Mambo stepped the rest of the way to his office, humming a riff from a Perez Prado classic while mimicking the band leader's trademark grunts.